alarmed.
All right, we are on, this is chapter 8 or chapter 9? Chapter 9, meekness and rest. Meekness and rest. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
I want to make a comment.
Yeah, throw it in there.
I thought your sermon on Sunday fit in so nicely with what we've been talking about.
Oh, okay. Good. What did I say? I don't remember.
Love other people. That was the general thought.
Okay. Let me see if I can remember. I'm not being coy and I'm not being dismissive. I often don't remember particular sermons relatively shortly after I give them.
That's good. You're listening to the Lord.
This was Easter 5, and I remember the gospel is very simple. It was the love one another. It was upper room. Revelation 21. That's what it was. Revelation 21 and Acts 11 about the no, Lydia's this week. It was about kosher food and that which God has made clean or pure. So basically the Spirit being poured upon the Gentiles as well as the Jews. When possible, I think it is worth as a preacher to make deliberate reference to the concept of biblical love being less about feelings and more about faithfulness, less about emotion and more about commitment. Feelings and emotions are not oppositional to love. It's not, they have nothing to do with it, but it's just real easy for us to see love as a purely emotional, a feelings-based event. But the love of Scripture, the divine love, that when we're supposed to love one another the way Jesus loves us, is it's faithful, it's committed, it's strong, even when our feelings aren't. Because sometimes I feel loving and sometimes I don't, but I still need to love you. And sometimes you are easy to love and very lovable, and sometimes you're not. And I still need to love you. And that's that faithfulness and fidelity, because that's how God loves us, even when we are unlovable, even when we are little pains in the rear, even when we are obnoxious, while we were yet sinners. So that's that measure of what it ought to look like with us. And so, speaking with the sacrament of holy matrimony, that's a perfect time, because our emotions, they're up and down. They're kind of fickle. And who in the world knows, when you're going to have a particular feeling and when you're not. And sometimes it's what you had for breakfast, or getting cut off in traffic, or just the phase of the moon. Who knows? But you can be in a bad mood, or the other person can be in a bad mood. But the covenant of matrimony says, this love I have for you, modeled after the love of Christ for his church, is going to stand by you and stand with you when I feel like it and when I don't. And that's not a bad thing to be reminded of on an ongoing basis, because I certainly need to. It's very easy to use the term unconditional love, but unconditional love honestly means when it's hard. Unconditional love is not unconditional when it's really easy to do. You don't know if it's conditional or not. It's so easy. The unconditional love is only unconditional when it's hard to do. Okay, so meekness and rest. We just had the Beatitudes not that long ago. I think it was still in Lent, like Lent 4, something like that. I remember that because I make the bulletin covers and I try to choose like a piece of art or a picture or a phrase or something like that. And I picked a nice artistic photo of the Church of the Beatitudes in the Galilee region of Israel. So they think they've identified where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. And it's not a mountain, it's more like a grassy hill overlooking the Sea of Galilee. And you can almost imagine people crowded around. Well, they built a church there. There's a bunch of little churches, kind of up and down to commemorate various places and miracles and teachings that Jesus did around the Sea of Galilee. What's kind of neat about the Church of the Beatitude is when you look at them as a list, traditionally they're considered to be 8 Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, that kind of stuff. And you've got all these little stone markers around with individual Beatitudes engraved in marble on a little footpath. It's very beautiful to walk around this garden, and you can, you get the little hilly sense of looking over the water. But then the church itself is octagonal. It's an 8-sided church to represent each of the 8 Beatitudes. It's very interesting architecture. It's very cool. And when you go inside, it's very striking with this kind of central altar right in the middle of the 8. And as the legend goes, the then rector of St. David's in Lakeland back in the 60s went to Israel and was so taken by the Church of the Beatitudes that he came back and said, we need to build our sanctuary to have 8 sides. So the St. David's Sanctuary, now Redemption Church, is that weird, funky, because of the Church of the Beatitudes. It doesn't really look like the Church of the Beatitudes at all. But it is 8-sided for that purpose. So anyway, that's a little nice little connection for some folks here. The concept of meekness, which is inherent in this pretty brief chapter. I want to say this is one of the briefer ones. To base an entire chapter, basically short or long, on meekness. So you kind of need to understand what it means. A lot of people have heard the meek shall inherit the earth because it's become kind of an aphorism. That's kind of like how people outside of the church, they've never cracked open a Bible, but they know the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It's just become a phrase that exists outside of Scripture, outside of the church, outside of even formal religion. In the wider culture, it's almost like a wise saying or an aphorism or whatever. The meek shall inherit the earth. And people who have no context of where this comes from still they know of this phrase. So we might have an opinion about what this means, but I want to ask for a second, what do we think other people think this means, especially people outside of the church? Like, they don't know the whole set of Beatitudes. They don't know the Sermon on the Mount. They might even know that Jesus was the one who said this, but they know, or they've heard at some point, the meek shall inherit the earth. What do you think that means to someone with no other context?
They might hear the word meek up with poor.
Meek and poor, okay, because we've already had the poor, blessed are the poor, the blessed are the poor in spirit. So maybe we stick those two together. What else? Humility, okay. I think meekness and humility, even if you don't have much context, you can still connect those terms. What else? Quiet. Yeah, I think so.
Docile.
Wishy-washy.
Docile. Yeah. Like docile, like a sheep.
Like a lamb.
Yeah, like a lamb. Mom, you were saying something?
Kind of wishy-washy.
Wishy-washy.
Uh-huh.
So I'm going to suggest that meekness is not a societal virtue. It's not a contemporary virtue outside of the church. And meekness is kind of a weird word that you don't tend to use very much. Like it kind of feels old-fashioned. So if people know the word at all, they might not recognize what it means. But if they do recognize what it means, I'm going to toss out that I think that there's kind of a snap association between meek and weak. They both sound alike, but when you don't have much context about what meekness means, I think your brain just sort of jumps to being passive and weak, wimpy.
Something that you would look down on.
You would look down on it, like mousy. Like someone can be quiet and contemplative, like still waters run deep, and somebody can be quiet and mousy. Like if you even look at them hard, they kind of shrink. Don't look at me. I think if people understand meekness at all, it's with a broadly negative connotation. Being meek means you're a doormat.
Yeah.
Being meek means you get taken advantage of. Being meek means you're a pushover. Am I off base or, okay.
Oh,
That's the general sense I think that I get, that this is what, like, again, people outside of the church, they know this, but it almost seems like they don't like it. The meek shall inherit the earth, but it's like, oh, it's one of those churchy things that, the mousy, nerdy, wimpy people are going to be on top one day. Sure, whatever. That's stupid. I would say, generally speaking, in not just our culture, but I would, my guess is off a lot of cultures today, being meek is not a sign of strength. It's not a sign of capability. It is either generally negative or at least not desirable. Like even if it's neutral, you wouldn't really want it. It's like, it's not bad to be left-handed, but it is inconvenient. So if you have a meek temperament or personality, maybe that's not bad, but it's not very good for you. Why would meekness be negative today? Be negative today.
Because it takes aggressiveness to get ahead, to succeed.
Yeah, right. I think that's exactly it. You've got to work hard. You've got to be tough. You've got to be strong. And all of those things connote aggressiveness. They connote going and getting it, standing up for yourself. Having power. That strength is overt. It's funny that I kind of feel like I've got a martial arts anecdote for all of these chapters. I don't know why. For some reason, my mind keeps going back there. But you train in this particular art, and it considers itself a defensive art rather than an offensive art. It's not about going out and pushing people around or grabbing stuff. It's about protecting yourself and protecting other people. But one of the things that I tell them is within the training, as you train your body, you will invariably train your mind and your spirit, that by knowing how to punch and kick and block and do these things, you actually wind up not punching and blocking and kicking. That most of the high-level practitioners I know are super gentle. And the people who are just starting out, they're the aggressive ones. So why would you think that is? Just guessing.
They have to show their strength and their power.
Why do you think they have to show their strength and their power?
I think the
Because they don't
more,
know how, yeah, it's all
go
right.
ahead, Pat.
They don't know how else to do it.
Okay, they don't know how else to do it because they're the one in charge. Mary, you said something?
Well, the more internal strength you have, the less overt it needs to be.
I really think that's true. And that's where I've seen it. These high-level practitioners are very secure in themselves. They've got nothing to prove. Can they mess you up? Yes, they can. But because they're so confident of that ability, they feel zero pressure to let you know. Because they're not looking for you to be impressed or scared. They don't have to make a big show of things because they feel very comfortable and secure in themselves. When you're insecure, you have the tendency to be more overt. And it's almost like trying to shout down your own insecurities. You have to tell everyone how tough you are. There's an old saying that if you have to tell people you're in charge, you are not in charge. There's a legal aphorism for attorneys. It's when the law is on your side, bang on the law. When the facts are on your side, bang on the facts. When neither of them are on your side, bang on the table. Make a big loud show of stuff is the idea, because you don't have anything else going for you.
Would the newbies maybe have the impression of Tai Chi or whatever kind of defense
Yeah.
it is, that it is aggressive, and
They could.
that's what they should do?
Sure. Yeah. She just says, if you're learning an art, maybe you've got the wrong impression that it is aggressive and you start using it that way. And that can certainly be a part of it. And the deeper you are in the art, the more you realize that it's not. And so, that's also, I'm relating this to meekness, because meekness is not weakness. Meekness is a choice. This is not to, I'm only making this personal because I'm not trying to identify other people by name who are not here. I'm a man capable of great violence. I have the physical capability, I have the training, and I have a temper. I may seem very even-keeled and mild-mannered, but that doesn't mean that I don't have a temper. But I have really trained myself and worked and tried to be disciplined in order to know how to respond in a way that I think is better, more faithful, more constructive. If I was someone who was not, pushing people around and knocking them down, stuff like that, because I couldn't, that would be different than someone who can and doesn't. Your ability to refrain from doing something you are capable of doing is different than not doing something you are incapable of doing. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And meekness in this regard is not about being just a sack of goo. It's not about the spineless jellyfish. It is about the person, regardless of what their power or ability might be as an individual, what they do with it. Everyone has the ability to, for instance, harm someone. Doesn't have to be physical. You could say something mean, you could do something mean, you could really hurt someone. You are capable of doing that. When you refrain from doing that, that's a choice, that's a decision. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It means you didn't do it. And there is a virtue in that. I would say there's a power in that, where how you use your power is a sign of that power. And the funny thing is, the people who go around, hurting people or using their abilities very carelessly or very aggressively are often, if not mostly, the people who feel the least amount of power. They have to overcompensate. This is the joke about the guy who does not feel well endowed, and so he buys this giant pickup truck or a sports car or flashy stuff. You know, you overcompensate in order to make yourself feel better, more powerful, more capable, whatever it is. It's like you make a big show of things to cover over the fact you actually don't feel very powerful. And the only way you can feel that way is by making such a big show of it that you can sort of maybe fool yourself into thinking you are. The people who are very good at what they do, I've often, not always, but often found to be the most humble about doing it. We've talked about this in other capacities. Like, it's the people who know a little bit about a subject who feel like they know everything, but the true experts in the field often will express their own humility. Like, oh no, there's a lot I don't know. And I would say meekness is a little bit related to that, in the sense of there is something of our will attached to it. Our capability is restrained through our will. Our power is disciplined, controlled through our will. We punch and we kick and we block, so we don't have to punch and kick and block. We talk about how the art is about it's about solving conflicts, making things better. But if you solve the conflict inside of you, you will find there are fewer conflicts on the outside trying to get in. And it's not so much that your circumstances change, but your perception does. But if you're not at peace within yourself, then everything that happens during the day is like poking sunburned skin. Everything is jarring. Everything hurts. Everything feels aggressive towards you. It's like there's a conflict everywhere you look. You've seen that, haven't you? When you're in a bad mood, doesn't it look like everybody's out to get you?
We're back to me, mine.
For sure, for sure. Your circumstances haven't changed a bit, but when you're in a foul mood or you're in a dark place, everything looks and feels very different. So we are back then to our own kind of inner self affecting how we see almost the totality of our lives. So the restraint of power, of ability, of capability being meekness, not an inability, not a lack of capability or power, to have somebody say something mean to you and not return it back would be meekness, not weakness, if you were capable of giving as good as you got, but you chose not to. Now, if you were somebody who couldn't do that and somebody insulted you or whatever made you feel bad, and you just like, you can't think of such things, or you're not, very quick on your feet or whatever it was, you're like, oh, there was no virtue in you not making a nasty comment back, right? Because it's like you couldn't. But when you could, but you don't. When something bad happens to you and you make the choice not to return it to the other person or make it worse for everyone. You could have, you chose not to. I would say that's more in the lines of biblical meekness. It is not an inability. It is ability restrained, controlled, and disciplined. Why would I go to such lengths to connect meekness with power restraint? Because we're getting back into in the meat of our chapter here. He explains it, but why?
Well, there's the old song about precious Jesus, meek and mild, and people think of him as a wimp.
Right.
And he can't do it, and he could do literally anything. He could zap us with his eyesight or whatever he needed to do, but he chooses not to.
Yeah, I'll occasionally use that precious Jesus, meek and mild as kind of a throwaway line for this sort of milksop, hippie Jesus, who's just like, the barefoot and sandals strumming a guitar with long greasy hair and just peace, man, and love. And that's not the picture we have of Jesus, nor is it the sum of his wholeness. Like, even if there's some overlap because he had the long hair, wore sandals, whatever. In Jesus, though he may not have been physically imposing, what power or capability did he lack? None.
None.
Jesus, who himself is our example of what meekness is. And I just have to come back to who did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself the form of a servant, emptied himself to become a form of a servant, and being obedient unto death, even death on a cross. And every part of that demonstrates ability restrained, or power that is chosen, disciplined, constrained in some fashion, grasping, almost like when we think about grasping, that's like using power and like gripping as hard as you can, hoping that it works. But instead, Jesus lays down ability and power. It's not he doesn't have it. The choice of his will is to not wipe us out again in a flood. It is to not have a legion of angels pull him from the cross and obliterate his enemies. It is not to tell Peter, you had the chance to stand by me like you said you would, but you denied me 3 times. I cast you out forever. That he has the ability to look at us and say, we are enemies, for you continually turn against me. You're on your own. That is our image of meekness. And we're not real big on humble, but humble, I would say, still has kind of a good reputation. Culturally. I think we like the idea of humility, even if we don't really want it.
We like it in other people.
We definitely want it in other people. I think we still culturally recoil from people who like act a little too much, a little too arrogant, a little too full of themselves. A celebrity who makes some sort of snotty comment about the fans, an athlete who rubs it in other people's faces when they score points, whatever it is that, we still want some mark of humility, but it's better to see it in other people. Ourselves being humble is a little trickier because it's either kind of unpleasant or we lose it instantly. I am so humble right now. I'm the most humble person you've ever met. But meekness, I think, is almost fully rejected all the way around. Yet they are so related. They're not the same thing, but I think the relation is the overlap is very significant. But ultimately, our example, if we don't know what it is, they're both found in the person of Christ himself. And we can ask for no better or fuller example of what true humanity ought to be than in the person of Jesus. For Jesus to be meek, then, is to stand in front of Pilate and not demand his own release. To know what needs to be done and to do it quietly and humbly, even though he has every ability to change whatever he wants. It is praying in the garden the night beforehand. If this cup may pass from me, but thy will be done. That is not a lack of ability. That's not being a wimp. It's not being a wuss. That's not being, just the empty-headed hippie flower child. That is full and complete power and authority that is purposefully and out of love set aside. You do it for a reason. We restrain ourselves and our own capabilities out of love in a variety of ways. When someone says something mean or whatever, and we don't immediately just obliterate them, but we try to maybe even absorb it, deflect it, or try to fix things and make it better.
I think about when children are starting to do something that you
Sure.
know isn't going to work,
Right.
and you keep still until you can guide them.
Or children who's are often very undisciplined, and their power and their actions are very unrestrained, and they smart off or say something awful, or they go do something dangerous, and all you really want to do is just snatch them back. But they're little, and you don't want to do that. And when you go tit for tat, yes, you can one up the child, I hope, but beyond the immediate sense of satisfaction that you put them in their place, you realize that when you say mean things to a child, it can actually cause things long term. It can change things negatively over a lifetime. And so you choose to temper your words or calm your actions or whatever it is. I was really struggling with something yesterday. A lot of stuff about, my will, God's will, talking about obedience, but is it? And, just a bunch of stuff like this. And it was exactly when I started reading this chapter. And it just, straight between the eyes, but exactly what I needed. Come to me, all that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm meek and lowly in heart. You shall find rest into your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. When we operate under our own power and authority, it is exhausting. I mean, sometimes it's fine. Sometimes you can manage just fine. But sometimes because of your circumstances or because of the issue at hand or because of the stakes, being on your own, having it all up to you is just such a burden. Like back-breaking, soul-crushing kind of burden. To lay those down in meekness and to take on the yoke of Christ is to say, a yoke is related to a harness. This is how beasts of burden, the oxen, the cattle, or whatever, were connected to the plow. Were connected to a cart, pulling something so that the power would be directed not in what the animal wanted to do, but what the driver knew needed to happen. Something like an ox is enormously powerful. Even a cow, if you've not been around a cow recently, you stand next to one like, ooh, even the small ones are pretty big. That power can be harnessed and do some pretty tremendous things. But if it's not harnessed, it kind of amounts to nothing. It just, wandering around, walking around, or just pushing into stuff, knocking stuff over. To say we take on the yoke of Christ is to say my leadership doesn't work out so well, but you will lead me, Lord, where I actually need to go. Not necessarily where I want to go, but where I need to go. And the power that I have will then be used under your direction and through your path. And then those good things will come about. I can make very compelling arguments for doing the stuff I want to do. It's just not always right. Might make a lot of sense. I might be, very interested, but I have certainly found many times in stark reality, God's plans are better than mine. And sometimes they go together, they coalesce. That's great. That's fun. That's where we ought to be. That's where we want to be. You actually desire what God desires of you, and it works in tandem, in harmony. Great. It's just, my life's not always like that. And sometimes when we're faced with stuff and I want to do something, or I think I ought to do something, or this is the direction or whatever, it can be difficult to discern because I can be very compelling. Especially when it's stuff I like or want, I can come up with some great arguments. I would not want to debate me. But I don't think that is unique to me. I think we are all capable of justifying ourselves when we want to. We are probably our best internal debaters.
Yeah.
Because when you really want something, it's real easy to come up with all the reasons why. And it can be very difficult to remember the whole restraint stuff. And this is where the yoke of Christ, where we seek to take into account not our will, but thy will. But even that is an act of will, right?
Yeah.
By saying it, by praying it, you're making a choice. Even if it's not fully successful, but that in and of itself is an act of our will seeking to restrain our own ability and power. Lord, I desire to set aside what I'm capable of doing, even maybe what I want to do, so that you might direct me to what I ought to do. And the best part about it is that whole passage we just read, that the yoke of Christ is actually lighter on our shoulders and on our hearts than the yoke we would put on ourselves. It actually gives us rest.
When we make decisions, quite often we don't really look at the possible consequences. And if we do, we think we're looking at the consequences, but we're using our yardstick
Right.
to make instead of God's yardstick.
Yep. No, I think you're absolutely right. I had a teacher in high school. My high school chemistry teacher, his name was Mr. Phillips. And I remember that so clearly because he said his name all the time, Phillips. And he said it kind of funny, but he loved saying his own name. And one of the things we did very early on was he was setting us up in this lab with supplies and stuff. He had these labs set out all over the classroom. And he gave like every group a ruler, like an old school wooden ruler. And he had his name written on the back, Phillips. So nobody would walk off with it because, you knew it was his. And so one of the things he would always do in every class is, what have I given you? A ruler. What does it measure? What's the measurement of this ruler? And if you were given a standard school ruler, what might you say? What's the measure of this ruler?
A foot.
A foot, 12 inches.
Inches.
And he said, absolutely not. This is a metric Phillips. 1 metric Phillips. You can tell because it's written on the back. When you measure something with that tool, you are only measuring of 1 Phillips at a time. For that is the standard that it is designed to measure. What he was doing was making a point. If we were to take all 30 rulers in that room and stack them side by side as closely as possible, there was going to be a variance of length. It might have been very small, but there might not have even been 2 that were exactly the same size. And yet we treat it as though that was the standard. And he said, they don't actually measure a foot. What in the world's a foot? What is a foot? And how do you know that that stick is actually the foot you say it that it is? Now, if I make up the standard and say it's a Phillips, then I know. And then he started talking about like there actually exists the meter. It's in a vault in France. It's in Paris. The meter, and it's made of some sort of metal alloy that's supposed to never contract, or its half-life is measured in the hundreds of thousands of years. You know, so by measurement, it's supposed to be solid and stable. But they can also measure the meter as it's like the distance of a wavelength of a certain frequency, because they want a singular standard that everything else can be compared to. So your meter stick at home is going to be close but not exact, bigger or smaller than the true meter. I take this little digression because Tom brought up a yardstick, and he's absolutely right. We are measuring by our yard. Whose yardstick are we using? Whose standard are we referring to? It ought to be the Lord's standard. Like the yardstick with a capital V and a capital Y that exists throughout all time, space, and eternity, an objective standard to which we are conformed to because it is always true and perfect and good. But we like to measure stuff off of our own set of principles, which are not particularly reliable. I mean, they can be, but then they change, so they're not. Because one day we feel like doing it one way, and another day we feel like it another way. And now we're back to the whole concept of biblical love that you brought up, because sometimes I feel like and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I am lovable and sometimes I'm not. So our own personal yardstick becomes an unreliable tool. But if we had one that was always, we could always count on and it never changed, wouldn't that be a better standard to use? And we do, as Christ himself says, I am the way and the truth and the life. This is a philosophical and theological principle when we speak about the nature of God and goodness. We have no way of measuring goodness except to appeal to the eternal nature of God himself. How are you going to say God is good or bad? What is the standard to which you're referring? Other than a personal one, stuff I like or stuff I don't like. What will you use to measure the nature of God? You can't, because God himself, goodness flows from him. Goodness is defined by him. And I know this is kind of a bit of a rabbit hole, but it is that sense of what God desires for us is right and good, even when we don't like it. And now we're right back to where we were with meekness. What standard are you going to use to say, well, God, what you want me to do is it's no good, it's bad, or it's dumb, or it's wrong? What standard are you appealing to? What externality to God are you saying you don't measure up to that? We got nothing.
Yep. Yeah.
We just got our own opinions and feelings at the moment, which is about as unreliable as it can get, because a year from now, you might feel and think completely differently. But that's what you're appealing to. Instead, I don't want to do this. I don't like this. I don't even necessarily agree with it. But thy will be done. Is that taking of our own power and ability, and with our will, constraining it, restraining it, disciplining it, setting it down, and say, I will remove my own personal standard because what I want to carry is the yoke of Christ, to be directed, even if I don't want to go, because that's the actual better place. I can't see all the ins and outs. I can barely plan my June schedule here halfway through May. How in the world am I going to know what an action is going to result in 35 years from now and to my future grandchildren? Like, impossible, impossible. But God knows these things. He sees the ins and the outs, all the ripples and the causes and the effects and all the threads of the tapestry and everything else. So whose standard is actually smarter? You know, there's been more than one thing that I didn't want to do. And I wound up either choosing to do it begrudgingly, or I was forced to do it because I had no other alternative. And it absolutely worked out better than what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
There is a scripture sentence from Ephesians. It's one of the closing sentences of morning prayer. And it's the one that I almost always use because it is just so good. Word of God, whose power working in us can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. It's more than we can even consider or plan. So many things in my life, I would not have done it that way. I would not have chosen that. That was not my preference. I had no concept at the time just how wrong I was. Just how blessed I was. Yeah.
The things that you do and that they go all haywire.
Sure.
And you think, well, I could have done it.
Right. It made perfect sense at the time.
Yeah.
You know, this is where the meekness comes in. To not defend ourselves, our reputation, our preferences, our priorities, all these things he starts listing out. To take on the cause of Christ says, I'm going to set down my power, my capabilities, even knowing it might be unpleasant, even knowing I might get criticized for it, even knowing I might get forgotten because of it. I might be treated like a doormat or like I was a wimp and a wuss. Other people might not be able to tell the difference, but God can. And I think we can too when we do it and make that choice. And it is, I would argue, the better place to be. It's rest for our souls. I will say the most exhausting thing I do is not physical, it's mental. On a given day, it's juggling what feels like 5,000 conflicting things and pressures where the stakes seem so impossibly high. And I feel like I've absolutely got to make the right choice, but I keep thinking all I'm doing is making wrong choices and it's only getting worse. That's what's most stressful for me. That's what gives me the gray hair. That's what makes me exhausted and feel, you know, the sense of fatigue or worn out or whatever. Whose yoke is doing that? He's not the one encouraging me to keep it all in my hands and try to juggle more balls than any person could juggle. He is not the one telling me it's all on my shoulders and everything else will be a disaster unless I do it all exactly right.
Well, he talks about deliverance from the burden of pretense
Yeah. She.
through meekness. And I think that's wonderful. I mean, we all try to put our best foot forward and, hide from the world what we really are.
Yeah,
Yeah. Mhm.
we're certainly not fooling God
No.
No,
when we
not fooling ourselves either.
very rarely do we fool ourselves, at least not successfully or not for long. I just came across a bit of online advice. I think it was like yesterday in a meme, but it was just like one of those nice little, like this is true. And it was talking about embarrassment. And it said something along the lines of, stop worrying so much about what other people think of you. They all think of you far less than you realize.
Yes, oh my gosh.
We have it in our heads that we slip and fall, or we say something and everyone is like watching and ready to pounce. And by and large, nobody's paying attention. You know, we're the only ones hyper focused on us. Nobody else is. So that's a sense of pretension as well, assuming that we are the center of attention, assuming we are of such importance that what we do either in success or failure is, being watched over by everybody else. And the reality is that's a part of our pride, just bubbling. We are, instead of forcing the issue of how important we must be, remember that's the parable of Jesus, to take your place at the end of the table, for then he will welcome you forward, and in the sight of everyone you will be honored. But don't just blunder in as though you demand by rights to sit at the top. Then we will be humiliated as we have to tuck our tail between our legs and slink back to the end.
Yeah.
We use the phrase swallowing our pride as kind of a negative, sort of like a negative eventuality. Well, I had to swallow my pride on that one. It's not something you want to do, but sometimes you have no other alternative. But in essence, for this, that's exactly what we're being, encouraged to do. If you swallow it and not just have it come up and out, but you give away its power over you. You consume it rather than letting it consume you. So that it's not our esteem, it's not our preference, it's not our will that we are forcing to happen through the whatever meager power and capability we could actually muster, but instead we take on a yoke of Christ, and that power that we have will actually become effective, and it will lead us into good places, into right and better things. Here's another little martial artsism. Control without power is useless. Power without control is dangerous. Being able to restrain that power not only prevents some of the danger, it actually makes it more effective. I teach the kids how to punch harder, not by making them physically stronger, but by making their actions more efficient, more focused. They don't waste motion or energy, and suddenly they generate more power. What would happen if someone was steering the ship and we were actually efficient with our efforts and our energy and our time? Think of all the good that could be done. I'm not a reliable guide to my own life. And the yoke that we ought to desire and we ought to ask for is the one that is good and it's restful. But we will need to start with that act of will to lay down our own power, to take on the yoke of Christ who is meek, we have to be meek too. But then when we allow him to guide and direct, not only would I say we're honestly going to be more effective and efficient, be even more successful, pretty sure I can say we will be more at peace. And sometimes you just can't put a price on that. What else?
I think it's interesting that in a farming situation, a farmer would want to yoke two equally strong animals together. And yet, if we are yoked to Jesus, it's totally skewed, and yet it works so much better.
Sure. I'm thinking of a picture, another cute internet picture where they have this very large dog, like a Great Dane or something like that, carrying this giant branch in its mouth, and there's a title underneath him, branch manager. And there's this little tiny dog kind of hanging off of one side, dangling because he's too small to even lift it. And underneath it says assistant branch manager. And you can almost hear that dog, the little dog, saying, "I'm helping."
You know, Mary, your point of being totally skewed separately is true, but yet in another way, it isn't true, because if we're yoked to Christ, and if we're doing Christ's will, he gives us all the strength to do everything that needs to be done in whatever way it needs to be done.
Yes, that was my point. As opposed to using our own strength, we get his strength.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Have you ever
It's-
felt like you were doing
it's-
the right thing, and you just like stuff, you were able to do more than you thought?
Oh, yeah.
Pat, you were gonna say something? Pat?
No, that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were saying you were bringing something up, and I stopped you on accident. What else? When this is a biblical promise. When we honor and glorify Christ, we will share in that honor and glory. But when we honor and glorify ourselves, we will lose both.
Yeah.
So this is a part of the meekness. This is a part of the yoking. This is a part of the other chapters before, the gazing with our souls and all this kind of stuff. Is, you know, who
And-
is first and foremost in doing what we do?
Don't you think we're living in a world that is really burdened with tremendous amounts of pride? We see it everywhere, you know, in politics and what's going on in Ukraine. So we have to turn to Christ, I guess, and his meekness to try to change this world.
I will say that genuine humility, I really do believe this, is still attractive. It's just not easy.
Mhm.
You know, it's difficult to do, so we don't do it. But when it's achieved, you notice, and it kind of makes a difference. But it just seems so risky. You know, letting it go out of your hands. You might get stepped on. You might get crushed. You might get tossed away. You might get hurt. You might get run over. Whatever it is. And it's
There's
inherently
all,
a risk. Mary?
it seems like there's an awful lot of people that live in a place of being the doormats rather than in meekness. Oops.
Oops,
Yeah, okay.
you're back.
Back to seminary days. I remember a seminary professor once saying that he didn't like the traditional rendering that the fundamental sin was pride, because there are certain people who their hamartia, missing the mark of sin, was in like self-deprecation and denigration. Like they didn't stick up for themselves. They like treating yourself badly by allowing others to treat you badly. And that was also not what the Lord intended for you. And therefore you were sinning and missing the mark in that regard. And it got a little convoluted and it got kind of wrapped up into gender politics for no good reason. But I do remember a kernel of it that I thought could be applied more broadly, in the sense that we do have sins of commission and omission, sins of doing the wrong thing and not doing the right thing. And so there may be people who are, in comparison or in a relative sense, very powerless and are constantly stepped on through no particular fault of their own, but find themselves in a circumstance where they're just constantly overpowered by everything and everyone.
I think a lot of that is result of the training and upbringing in their lives, in their early years, and incidents that have occurred to them that has really trampled on any sense of worth
Yes,
that individual may have.
it can certainly happen. I've seen it. People who are mistreated as children and told how worthless they are treated in a way that communicates that lack of worth over and over and over again. And you look at them and they almost wince when you look at them.
Mhm.
And I've been blessed to see a couple of folks really blossom through the grace of Christ from that. It's almost hurtful to see how damaged they can become. And it's very sobering to realize it's not just, we're not just saying stuff when we talk about how you can hurt a child and it cause long-term problems. I mean, it really, really does happen. You know, what I would say from our chapter to even folks like that is they carry that burden too. It's just different. They are still yoked in a sense of their own powerlessness and in a sense of their own maybe self-denigration or even self-hatred. That is a yoke. That is a burden.
Yes.
It's a destructive one. And the yoke of Christ for them is also easy and light, for when they allow Christ to direct them, he will direct them into places that give them life and bring
Exactly.
wholeness and peace.
Good session.
Anything else? All right, well, I will be totally honest, this chapter came for me at exactly the right time and said exactly what I needed to hear. And it's really kind of a blessed miracle and very humbling when that happens. So we've got one more, I think, right? Aren't we only one chapter away from being done?
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
All right, it is my intention that we will take some kind of break, whether it's a short break or a long break after this book, but we will finish next week and then we will be on some sort of break. If you've got thoughts or suggestions for the next thing we read, I will make a little list and we'll talk about it. But, you know, one way or another, we'll have some kind of pause as we move into June and the summer, whether we want to pick it up, you know, after just a couple of weeks, or if we want to just take a longer break than that, more of a summer break. But we will, we'll figure that out. Okay.
Very
Okay.
good.
See you guys next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.